You know what finally got under my skin? I built a pergola about 8 years ago, used good lumber, sealed the end grain, even set the posts on gravel for drainage. 2 years later, the base of every single post was soft enough to push my thumb into. Rot had crept up from the ground like it owned the place. I was so frustrated, I almost switched to composite materials entirely. Then I came across something that stopped me cold. In a valley in western Norway, there is a wooden church called Borgund. It was built around 1180. That is not a typo. This wooden structure has been standing through Norwegian winters for more than 800 years. No pressure-treated lumber, no galvanized brackets, no concrete footings, just wood, stone, and an understanding of timber that most of us have completely lost. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Norse builders constructed stave churches that have survived 1,000 winters, and what their methods can teach anyone who works with wood. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will share a grain reading technique I picked up from studying these churches that changed how I select lumber for every outdoor project. Let us get into it. Stave churches represent some of the oldest surviving wooden structures anywhere on Earth. And what makes them remarkable is not just their age. It is that they were built in one of the harshest timber climates imaginable, yet the methods behind them are surprisingly practical and accessible to anyone with a shop and a willingness to think differently about wood. So let me give you some background, because understanding who built these churches makes everything else click into place. The men who raised stave churches in Norway between roughly 1050 and 1350 were not architects in any modern sense. They were descendants of Viking-age shipwrights. These were the same families and trade lineages that had been building longships for generations. They understood wood the way a river guide understands water, not from textbooks, but from a lifetime of watching how it behaves under stress. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, these shipwrights were asked to build churches, and they did what any good craftsman would do. They took what they already knew and adapted it. The lap joints they had used to plank ship hulls got turned vertical. The keel became the sill. The ribs became the staves. They were not inventing from scratch. They were translating centuries of hard-won boat-building knowledge into a new form. Norway's climate gave them no room for error. Winters that drop well below zero, freeze-thaw cycles that can split a timber apart from the inside, driving rain, heavy snow loads, and damp ground that will rot untreated wood in just a few seasons. Every single detail of a stave church was designed to anticipate those forces, not to resist them with brute strength, but to work with them. That is the core principle I want you to carry through the rest of this video. These builders did not fight nature. They designed around it. And that one shift in thinking is what separates their work from most of what we do today. Now here is where it starts. Before a single joint was cut, before a single foundation stone was laid, the Norse builders made decisions about their timber that most modern woodworkers skip entirely. They chose their trees while they were still standing in the forest, and they were incredibly particular about it. They preferred Scots pine, specifically trees that had grown slowly at high altitude or on poor, rocky soil. A tree that grows fast in rich lowland soil produces wide growth rings and soft, porous wood. A tree that struggles for decades on a cold mountainside produces tight, dense growth rings packed with resin. That resin is not just a nuisance that gums up your saw blade. It is a natural preservative. It repels moisture, resists insects, and hardens over time into something almost like a built-in finish. But they went further than just picking dense trees. They looked for trees that had been stressed by prevailing winds, because a tree that has spent its life bracing against wind develops reaction wood on its leeward side that is denser and stronger. They looked at bark patterns, branch distribution, and the overall shape of the crown to read the grain before they ever made a cut. I will be honest. When I first learned about this, I felt a little foolish. I have spent decades picking lumber off a rack at the yard based on whether it looked straight and had minimal knots. These men were selecting their material with a sophistication I had never even considered. And here is the practical takeaway. You and I may not be hiking into mountain forests to pick standing timber, but we can absolutely learn to read the growth rings and grain density of the boards we buy. Tight rings, high resin content, and straight grain are not just nice to have. For outdoor work, they are The difference between a project that lasts 5 years and one that lasts 50. Now, let us talk about the single smartest thing these builders did, and the one that hit me hardest when I understood it. They never let wood touch the ground. Ever. Every stave church sits on a low stone foundation called a grundmur. These were not elaborate masonry walls. They were carefully stacked and fitted stones, typically rising about 12 to 18 inches above grade. On top of those stones, they laid massive timber sills, often hewn from a single log and shaped with a slight crown on the top surface, so water would sheet off rather than pool. But here is the critical detail. The sills did not sit flush on the stone. The stones were shaped and arranged so that air could circulate beneath and around the sill timbers. This created a gap, sometimes just an inch or two, that prevented capillary action from wicking ground moisture up into the wood. If you have ever seen a fence post rotting from the bottom up, you have seen exactly what happens when wood is in contact with damp ground or even damp concrete. Moisture moves upward through the end grain, and the rot starts from a place you cannot see until it is too late. The Norse builders understood this. They designed their entire foundation system around one simple idea: keep the wood dry from below and let air do the work of carrying moisture away. Compare that to how most of us build today. We sink posts into the ground, sometimes into concrete, and then wonder why they rot. We set deck ledger boards tight against house sheathing with no drainage plane, and then blame the lumber when it fails. The stave church builders would have looked at our methods and shaken their heads. Their solution was not a product you buy. It was a design principle you follow. Separate wood from earth. Allow air movement. Shape every surface so water leaves instead of stays. I have applied this thinking to every outdoor project I have built since I learned it, and the difference is remarkable. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Once I saw how they handled the foundation, it made complete sense why they also designed their corner joints the way they did. A stave church is not a small building. Some of them rise 40 or 50 feet with multiple tiers. In a climate where temperatures swing from well below zero in January to 60 or 70 degrees in summer, every timber in that structure is constantly expanding, contracting, and shifting. If you lock everything together with rigid joints, the way a lot of modern timber framing does, those seasonal movements will eventually crack the joints or split the wood. The Norse builders used interlocking notched and lapped joints at the corners and at critical connection points throughout the frame. These joints were clearly influenced by shipbuilding. A longship hull has to flex with wave action or it breaks apart. The same principle applied vertically. Their church joints were cut so that the mating surfaces could slide against each other by tiny amounts as the wood moved, but the interlocking geometry prevented the joint from pulling apart. Think of it like two hands with fingers interlaced. You can twist and shift, but you cannot pull them apart without deliberate effort. The specific geometry varied, but many of these joints feature a combination of a cross lap with a locking notch or tenon that captures the joint under load. As the weight of the roof and upper tiers pressed down, the joints actually seated tighter. Wind, loads that pushed the structure laterally, were absorbed by the flex in these connections rather than concentrated at a single rigid point. I spent a long afternoon trying to reproduce one of these joints from drawings I found in a conservation study, and I will tell you, the fit was extraordinary. Snug, but not forced. Firm, but not brittle. It felt alive in a way that a bolted connection never does. Now, let me explain the wall system itself, because this is where the name stave church comes from and where the vertical grain engineering really shines. The word stave refers to the vertical planks that form the walls. These were not sawn boards. They were split from logs using wedges, which means the grain runs perfectly continuous from top to bottom of each plank. That matters enormously for durability. When you saw a board, you inevitably cut across some grain lines, creating pathways for moisture to enter. A split plank follows the natural grain structure of the tree, leaving those pathways intact and sealed. These staves were set vertically into grooves cut along the top face of the ground sills. A corresponding groove in the top plate captured the upper end. The edges of adjacent staves were often shaped with a tongue and groove profile, so they interlocked sideways, creating a wall that was weather-tight but could still breathe. Moisture that got past the exterior surface could migrate through the wall and evaporate from the interior side, rather than getting trapped and causing rot. Compare this to horizontal log construction, where every log presents its side grain to the weather, and every joint between logs is a potential entry point for water. The stave system is fundamentally more resistant to moisture because it respects the way wood moves and the way water interacts with grain direction. Vertical grain sheds water, horizontal grain absorbs it. The Norse builders knew this, and they built their entire wall system around it. The last method I want to cover is their approach to finishing, because this might be the most underappreciated factor in the survival of these churches. The Norse builders used pine tar, known in Norwegian as shear. They produced it by burning resinous pine stumps and roots in earthen kilns, a slow, low-oxygen process that extracted the tar without destroying it. The resulting liquid is dark, thick, and loaded with natural compounds that repel water, resist fungal growth, and discourage insects. They applied this tar to every exterior surface of the church, and they reapplied it regularly, sometimes every few years. This was not an afterthought or a cosmetic finish. It was a core part of the building's survival strategy, as important as the foundation or the joints. The chemistry behind pine tar is genuinely impressive. It penetrates deep into the wood fibers rather than sitting on the surface like a film finish. As it ages, it polymerizes and hardens, becoming more durable rather than less. And because it is derived from the same species of wood it is protecting, it is chemically compatible in a way that synthetic finishes simply are not. Most of us treat exterior finish as the last step, something we do after the real building is done. The Norse builders treated it as a structural decision made before construction even began. They knew that without tar, even perfectly jointed and perfectly sited wood would eventually fail. The finish was not decoration, it was survival. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is relying on chemical preservatives instead of design. Most of us buy pressure-treated lumber and assume the chemicals will handle moisture for us. The Norse approach says design your structure so wood never contacts moisture in the first place. The chemicals are a backup at best, and they break down over time. Good design does not. The second pattern is setting wood in ground contact. I did this for years because that is just how things are built in every framing manual I ever read. But the Stave church builders proved that elevating wood on stone with an air gap is worth more than any ground contact rated lumber. The third pattern is using rigid mechanical fasteners everywhere. Bolts and screws feel strong, but they create stress concentration points. The Norse interlocking joints distributed loads across broad surfaces and allowed seasonal movement without failure. There is a lesson there for anyone building outdoor structures in climates with big temperature swings. The fourth pattern is treating finish as an afterthought. We build the project, then grab a can of whatever is on the shelf. The Norse builders planned their finishing strategy before they cut the first joint. Pine tar was not optional. It was structural. If we thought about exterior finish that way, our projects would last decades longer. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I started doing after studying photographs and conservation drawings of Stave church sills, and it has made a noticeable difference in my outdoor projects. When you are selecting lumber for any horizontal member that will be exposed to weather, a sill plate, a deck joist, a garden bed frame, look at the end grain carefully. You want the growth rings to arc so that the bark side faces up, what old-timers call crown up. But go further than that. Look for the tightest ring spacing you can find and orient the board so that the tightest rings are on the top face, the face that will see the most weather. Those dense, tight rings are more resin-rich and more resistant to moisture penetration. The Norse builders did this instinctively because they had split their timbers from carefully selected trees and could see exactly how the grain ran We can do the same thing at the lumber yard if we take an extra 5 minutes to read the end grain of every board we pick up. I have been doing this for about 3 years now, and the difference in how my outdoor joints are holding up is significant. No rot, no soft spots, just tight, hard grain facing the weather exactly the way it should. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. These Norse builders figured out things 1,000 years ago that most of us are still getting wrong today. And the beautiful part is, none of it requires expensive tools or exotic materials. It just requires paying attention to how wood actually behaves and designing around that instead of fighting it. I will see you in the next one.